Yesterday was the 14th birthday of Bitcoin, the very first of the cryptocurrencies. It was first mined on January 3rd, 2009 by Satoshi Nakamoto. He created the Bitcoin, the first Bitcoin block on that date. Some of the early real-world transaction, the main one, the first one that occurred was in 2010 when a fellow by the name of Laszlo Hanziek purchased 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin. That would be $167 million in today's Bitcoin money. But, you find the Bitcoin community celebrating this on Twitter on May 22nd. They call it Bitcoin Pizza Day. The Bitcoin reached a $1 value in February of 2011. In 2013, it crossed $1,000 per token. And the all-time high was last year at $69,000. El Salvador and the Central African Republic have both made Bitcoin official currency. Professor Richard Wolff and I had a conversation about Bitcoin on this program, and we were both broadly, I think, of the opinion that it was A, a bubble, and B, a commodity and not a currency, if I'm saying that right. But let's check back with him and see what his thoughts are on what is the future of Bitcoin. Is there a role for alternative money? And also, what is money? Professor Richard Wolff is the Economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books, including his most recent, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, also available now as an ebook. And he hosts the Economic Update with Professor Richard Wolff right here on Free Speech TV. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program. I'm wondering if you could just, share with us your thoughts on Bitcoin. I mean, exactly what you were predicting seems to have come to pass with the great crash of Bitcoin.
I don't much believe in predictions, so I'm not going to dwell on that or pat myself or even you on the back. It didn't take a great deal of insight to understand that the conditions making for these kinds of cryptocurrencies are the conditions that will make it extremely volatile, extremely risky. I would only assert for the people listening and watching your program not to get drawn in unless they really understand the enormity of the risk they're taking. Bitcoin's value has collapsed in double-digit percentages. It's a very wobbly item. The story you mentioned and many others are full of predictions for the next year, which run the gamut from making much more money than it did in the past to making even less money than it did in the past, and everything in between. Here's what I think is going on. In capitalism as a system, every kind of business that has ever been invented has been, sooner or later, abusively manipulated, whether it's banks or farming or manufacture or services. That's why we're full of commissions in the United States. Once upon a time, you could run a taxi service, but then there were crooks who abused it and didn't use safe vehicles and didn't insure what they did. And so we have a commission in virtually every city governing the taxis. And the commission works it out so it's safe by having a price that covers the costs of safety. And what happens sooner or later is a couple of hustlers come in and try to substitute, without the commission, a similar product. These days we call them Lyft and Uber. They come in, run a taxi service in effect, without the rules, make a lot of money, then a lot of bad things happen, and now they have to be regulated. Money is no different. Money is something that we used to, when we first started as a nation, let banks do. But they were crooked in many cases. You couldn't rely on the money. You couldn't be sure who issued it or who would honor it if you tried to cash it in. So we had the government come in either with a commission or the Bank of the United States, eventually now the Federal Reserve, the controller of the currency, in order to make it reliable. Money will always generate people who try to get around the rules, make a lot of money for a short while, and then teach us why we put rules in effect in the first place. And now guess what? Federal reserves, central banks around the world are getting in on fiat, on this kind of money. Cryptocurrencies are being issued by central banks. They're going to control it. They're going to limit it. And given the volatility and how many people lost money, you're building the public support for exactly that kind of control. But I guess there will always be people who want to get around it, come up with some novel technology to do that, promise us the world of freedom from control, and then demonstrate to us why we've always gone back to that control, because the so-called freedom from it is too costly for too many of us.
That's a brilliant analysis, which raises the question, is Bitcoin a currency or a commodity?
What you're doing by your question, Tom, is actually recapitulating the history of what we're talking about. Money initially was a commodity. That's why it was gold and silver. It was indeed a commodity that had other uses besides being money. Gold was a process in manufacturing. Gold was a kind of jewelry. Silver, same thing, and yet other silver used to be important in processing photo activities and so forth. So the line between commodity and money is a very subjective question of historical moment. At a point, it's a commodity. At another point, it's money. And at another point, it's both of those things trying to navigate the passage from one to the other. Even to this day, gold is mined not only because it's a monetary item, but also because in parts of the world, it's a very important commodity in the jewelry business, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're always struggling to get a boundary, sort of, between commodity and money. But because money is so important and we're so worried about it being abused in one way or another, because it always has been, we want to have a backup, something we can be more sure about than the money, and particularly these days, the money is represented by a piece of paper. So we want something solid behind it. Gold, silver, or some other commodity has to play that kind of role. So I don't think we'll ever escape from that ambiguity. And as long as we have capitalism, we're not going to escape from the endless process of controlling, managing, having the government come in, then trying to escape, then discovering we can't. After a certain point, we kind of ought to ask ourselves the question, is there something wrong with the system that puts us in this repetitive cycle over and over again, especially when gullible people can lose their entire life savings somewhere in the process?
How can a commodity exist without existence? I mean, gold you can hold in your hand, right? You can buy, shares of gold electronically and things like that. But by and large, there's always gold at the end of the, even the people who are selling ETFs for gold, exchange traded funds for gold are, they've got gold in their basement basically, and they're saying you're buying a piece of this gold. With Bitcoin, what you're buying are zeros and ones. It is an intangible tangible.
Well, let me push back a little bit. I don't think there's anywhere near as big a difference as most people do. In the end, yeah, it's a matter of faith. Do you believe in the piece of paper that says Federal Reserve note on it, like our currency does here in this country? Do you believe the Bitcoin receipt you have when you invested there? But it's not that different from what's the value of gold? It has to do with people's attitudes. If people decide that gold isn't all that beautiful and that something else is more beautiful, the demand for gold will disappear, or at least it'll shrink a great deal, and that will destroy its value. People have been disappointed by the disappearing value of things they could touch and feel and smell and see in their hands almost as much as they have with money. So I think in the end, it's a kind of a reminder lesson that the economy, like so much else in our lives, is not the hard and fast and fixed and under control reality we might wish it to be. It is, in fact, very conditional on the politics, the ideology, the history, the culture we live in, and we maybe ought to pay more attention to that as being what in the end determines value than attaching ourselves to something as if it had a value no matter what.